Hello, everyone. Welcome. We're going to give it a few moments as more folks trickle in. Welcome to folks who are just trickling in. We'll get started in just a few moments. Looking at the chat and saying hello to folks who have said hello to us. Welcome. All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. My name is Nancy Magkusau. I use she, her gender pronouns, and I work at the Cross Cultural Center. And we welcome you to the Cross Cultural Center's Equity Talks for Staff by Staff. Today's talk is called Rise Up, Justice for Asian and Pacific Islander Communities. And I am pleased to introduce our two facilitators today. We have Sam Choi, who is the Assistant Director at School of Global Policy and Strategy. And our second facilitator is Frida Alvear, who is the Associate Director of Communication and Leadership and Community Service at the Center for Student Involvement. I have a couple of disclaimer announcements to make. We will be recording this presentation. We also have closed captioning on. The closed caption may not always be so accurate. I wanted to put that out there. And with that, I'd like to pass it on to our two facilitators, Sam and Frida.
Thank you, Nancy, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here. Once again, my name is Frida Pineda Alvear. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm happy to serve as a co-facilitator for our talk today. And so just some other fun facts about myself. I am from San Diego, born and raised, and I identify as Pinay, as a first-gen graduate, and also as an alum of UC San Diego. So I will invite my co-facilitator to also introduce himself.
Thanks, Frida and Nancy. Hello, everyone. My name is Samuel Choi, and pronouns are he, him, his. And I work as the Assistant Director for the 21st Century China Center. And I've also been, over this past year, been involved with a lot of these discussions about how do we build API power, how do we respond to the recent rise in violence. I'm just so grateful to be in this space with you all and learn how we can do more together as a staff here on campus to make our campus more equitable and to demonstrate what diversity looks like and how we can value each other in this region.
Thank you, Sam. And so before we continue on, I know we all, a good majority of us are here working virtually and tuning into our own homes, residences, but we also want to acknowledge the land that UC San Diego physically sits on and to provide land acknowledgement, give respect to the Kumeyaay Nation. And so I'm going to read the land acknowledgement here that's also provided to you on the slide. And it goes, the UC San Diego community holds great respect for the land and original people of the area where our campus is located. The university was built on the unceded territory of the Kumeyaay Nation. Today, the Kumeyaay people continue to maintain their political sovereignty and cultural traditions as vital members of the San Diego community. We are honored to share this space with them, and we thank them for their stewardship. And this was adapted from the UC San Diego Intertribal Resource Center. To keep this in mind as we navigate our conversation today, while the talk today is focused on justice for Asian and Pacific Islander communities, to also acknowledge how our communities are also situated with communities at large, especially with our Black, Indigenous, and other people of color. And so to give you an overview of our time today, when Sam and I were invited to lead this talk with Nancy, we wanted this to really be more of a conversational talk. And so obviously we have here some slides for you all, but it's really to serve as a guidance for our conversations. We're going to start with some introductions and context. We're going to have you all go into small group discussions to discuss some of the questions that we have posed for you all. And then we'll invite everyone to come back into the large group to share out any reflections, summaries, your own personal experiences that you all have discussed, either within those breakout rooms or even experiences that you have not yet named in our time together. And then we'll wrap up our time together with talking about our call to action and any resources that folks want to provide. We also wanted to help lay the foundation of the space by sharing these community values that it is my hope that we all can uphold. So keeping in mind our I statements, so speaking from my perspective and my experiences and really taking ownership of that, respect and just participation. I know it's also lunchtime and folks might have their videos off and folks might be unmuted, but to engage in whatever that looks like for you, whether it's in the chat, whether it's unmuting yourself. Make space, take space. Sam and I are here as co-facilitators, and so it is our hope, at least my hope, that you all really engage and share your own experiences and thoughts about what justice for Asian and Pacific Islander communities may look like. At this time, I also wanted to invite you all as attendees, if anyone had any additional community values that you wanted to contribute during this time, feel free to do so. And I invite you to either put that in the chat, or if you want to unmute and share that vocally, you're more than welcome to do so now. Seek to understand from Eddie Pahe. Thank you for sharing that.
Satomi also said it's okay to be uncomfortable.
Second, Amy seconds that from Satomi, if I'm pronouncing correctly. Any other community values that you want to contribute at this time? All right, so with that being said, if we can have you affirm to agree to these values by either giving a thumbs up or putting it in the chat, that will help also just affirm that we can move on to the remainder of our talk today. So I'm seeing thumbs, thank you. No worries, Grace, thank you. So I will invite Sam to speak about this video that we're going to share shortly.
Thanks, Frida. Yes, in the spirit of making space, I've been rediscovering the power of poetry. I by no means have any of those skills, but I've really appreciated, especially over the course of this year, racial reckoning and understanding why there has been a rise of Asian American anti-Asian hate and how that connects to our personal stories and connect to history. We could listen to this poet for the next 3 minutes to both center us, shake up the rhythm, and then I'm going to reflect a couple of more minutes about my own personal journey. And hopefully that will open a space for us to think together and to share with one another how our stories intersect with this moment. Without further ado, Frida, please go ahead and play the video.
8 responses to the phrase, go back to where you came from. 1, oh, you mean Minnesota? In which case, here I am. 2, oh, you mean where I'm really from? In which case, here I am. 3, if this is a reference to my people, then you're gonna have to be a little bit more specific. How about try and go back to St. Paul, or go back to Fresno, go back to Bunby Nai, go back to Longgang, go back to San Quang upon taking my advice. Also realize that you're not the first to give the command return to point us in the opposite direction with the barrel of a pistol. Call me Hmong before you call me American, because Hmong is the closest word I know to home for. Do you ever wonder where you come from? Do you find comfort in vague memories of Ellis Island? How many servings from the melting pot did it take for you to arrive at this conversation? Maybe you take pride in the Mayflower. Maybe you are an original American. Do you ever ask yourself if maybe the land we stand on today once belonged to someone else? Do you ever ask yourself if maybe the land never belonged to any of us, and if instead we belong to the land? 5, when I was younger, I took the journey back to Thailand, hoping to find our villages still dotting the sides of mountains, hoping to hear Kutsia still echoing throughout the valleys. Upon entering the house of an elder, he apologizes to me. Embarrassed that his youngest son could not introduce himself to me in our language, tells me that if you're all grown up to be anything more than a farmer or a servant in this country, you must learn to leave your language behind. I want to tell this man that throughout my time here, I've never felt so close to where I come from. 6, my mother tells me that before I ever took in my first breath, I was an invisible spirit floating around in the clouds, waiting for a stomach that could paint me pink. My mother tells me that death is a slow journey back, that if not done carefully, we will wander the earth, cursing those still living, but under the watchful eyes of our loved ones, we will always know our way home. 7, for the longest time, I believe that the hummingbird did not possess a pair of feet, instead always existing in a state of mid-flight. How sad, I thought, to always be at the mercy of the wind, to be so close to the earth, yet own none of it. My time here has taught me how lucky the hummingbird to belong to the sky. 8, I'm going.
That was the Hmong American poet Kevin Yang. in his poem, Come Home. So that's a question that I've been wrestling with most of my life. The idea of home, how I seldom felt like I belong anywhere. And so as we have wrestled with this past year of anti-Asian harassment and violence, that is unfortunately a very common phrase. Go back to where you come from. And for me, as a 36-year-old, I would like to think through my own journey of becoming an Asian American. I came to this country when I was 8 years old with my family. We immigrated from Hong Kong. For the first 12 years, 3/3 of my life, first 12 years, I wouldn't say I don't identify with either Asian or American. I was simply Chinese, and then specifically a Hong Kong person from this territory that was colonized and occupied by the British, that was later on returned to China. And again, even that particular identity, it embodies that hummingbird image that Kevin talked about, in that I never felt like I have this full sense of being Chinese, because I grew up speaking Cantonese and learning English in school. So by the time I got here, I had to wrestle with being, quote unquote, fresh off the boat, where I just simply needed to even fit in with other Chinese Americans. And so for that initial part of elementary school, when I first immigrated here, it was definitely a time where I felt like my life was very much in this particular enclave where, my family, we all went to Chinese grocery stores, we went to a Chinese church, we hang out in Chinatown. And I just had to hold on both to my heritage, but at the same time, trying to fit in to what it means to be a part of this country now. And so in the second third, high school, college, I think that was when I really first heard of the term Asian American. And, like many people back in those days in early social media, everyone had the AZN, screen name, AZN this, AZN that. And there was definitely a lot of pride associated with becoming Asian, but it didn't really stick with me really until in college, where I went to a predominantly white campus, where I was suddenly now forced to really confront the fact that I am a minority, even though, of course, growing up in Boston, even though I had a lot of people who looked like me that I grew up with, you stray 2 exits off the highway or you go to a different town, you're going to be reminded that you're a minority. And I've definitely heard countless times, either, in the sidewalk or people pulling up to me, go back to where you come from. And so in college, I really had to then find my people. And so I think that's really where I started to identify with the label Asian American. But even within that, it was really just mostly East Asians, mostly people who are with ancestry from China, Japan, South Korea. And so it wasn't really until just the third of my life where I moved here to California, becoming a parent of multiracial children, where I really see kind of the fuller scope and breadth of that label Asian American, where now I'm really meeting folks from Southeast Asia, South Asia, and then obviously now being by the actual Pacific Ocean, Pacific Islanders and Native Hawaiians. And it's something that I'm still on the journey on. And I think as we will discuss later this hour, what does it really mean for us to use that label? As useful as it is in terms of political organization and building power, there's also a lot of things that are problematic about this awkward term, this umbrella called Asian American Pacific Islander. I actually love to go to the next slide and think about this question a little bit more. Feel free to use the chat box or even unmute yourself and share about how you have perceived this label, this identity that we call Asian Pacific Islander American. For those who identify with it, even if you have ancestry or heritage, or if you don't have ancestry and heritage, how do you perceive this identity? Whether that's from how you've been socialized, the media that you consume, from pop culture, your own community upbringing. how do you perceive this identity? Love to hear from folks either on the chat or through muting. We'll spend a few minutes hearing some thoughts on this question. See Jasmine reflecting on her upbringing in New England as well. Eddie, do you have a comment?
Yeah, so and sorry, I don't mean to hijack the meeting. I just want to make sure I get my voice out there at this point, because I have to run off and go pick up my daughter pretty soon. But one of the things during this time of racial reckoning with anti-Blackness and with anti-Asian hate going on, I as a Pacific Islander have kind of just felt like, okay, where do I stand in this? Because in a lot of the propaganda that's being put out is AAPI, but yet there's no focus on the Pacific Islander community and what we're dealing with, or what I'm dealing with. And so I've been in talks with a couple nonprofits lately. One of them's the Stop Anti-Asian or AAPI Hate, along with empowering Pacific Islander communities. And the general the consensus from those organizations is that Pacific Islanders, we support and stand with our Asian American colleagues and communities, but and we want to be in partnership through this, but we also want to be recognized and have our own autonomy as well.
Thank you, Eddie. Thank you for uplifting that. As I have admitted, it's something that I'm still learning in terms of the diversity of the Pacific Islander identity. And I see in your background, the Union Jack and the flag, and it's something that growing up in Hong Kong, I've seen a lot. And I even flew the colonial Hong Kong flag proudly growing up, and now reflecting on the fact that for a lot of folks in the Pacific Islands and all throughout Asia Pacific, there is a lot of commonality when it comes to the experience of colonialism, especially Western colonialism. And so it's something that I think I'm still grappling with in terms of how do I relate to folks who are under that banner. And I think the experience of being othered, the experience of having your homeland being occupied by a different force and being forced to speak the language we're using today, English, and being able to acknowledge the fact that even a lot of us, especially myself, feel the urge and the urgency growing up to practice speaking English in a way that does not show my foreignness or does not reveal my inadequacy or lack of belonging. But I think that that's something that I definitely can relate to, and I love to create more spaces where we could have more sharing and stories of both Asian Americans and Pacific Islander communities. Please allow me to read what David submitted here. David said, I grew up in rural white Iowa, where there is little diversity, but I was lucky to grow up in a small circle of mostly international friends from Asian countries, which allowed me to learn directly about their identities and culture. I also walked beside them in their struggle against anti-Asian racism and their different ways of approaching adapting to the US. Thank you, David, for that. And I think that's something that is becoming more and more common across the United States, even in outside of urban centers, where because of the internationalization of higher education and many, especially publicly funded universities, have been recruiting and admitting international students from all over the world, especially in Asia. A lot of communities are now grappling with the rise of diversity. And I think in our campus here, and in particular the center that I work with, we do acknowledge that that is another mix into this identity question, is that there are a lot of folks who are here to study, maybe temporarily, maybe they want to stay long-term, depending on the visa, immigration status, and opportunities. Some people see themselves as temporary, and some people might see themselves as potentially want to become nationalized, want to become Americans. And then I think we're all part of that spectrum and journey in terms of how we identify, and the fact that there is a large portion of us who are of Asian heritage that are international students on a campus like this is something that I would love to, again, create more space to discuss. I'm gonna read one more comment and then we'll move on to the small group discussion. Amy wrote here, my husband is Chinese, Mexican American, and does not call himself Asian. A friend who is East Indian American also does not call himself Asian. Friends who are Italian American want to keep their family culture and do not consider themselves European American. So I wonder whether Asian American is too broad for one's identity. Although I recognize that for non-Asian Americans, it may be easier to lump them all together. Sorry for the choice of words, although it seemed reflective of attitudes I have observed. Yes, 100%. Actually, I want to read one more from Margaret. I remember when I was 6 years old and I told my parents that we were Lao and Chinese because someone called me that in school and they laughed at me and said, I'm just Lao. A lot to chew on there in terms of the usefulness, the way that the label Asian American is still something that some people are not comfortable using. And I think more people are definitely more comfortable with more ethnic specific identities than the broad kind of awkward term of Asia. And this reminds me of a title of a book by an author that names the fact that there are no Asians in Asia. Not many people in Asia actually even see themselves as Asian. It's just the largest landmass in the world, and it's hard to lump, everybody in that hemisphere into one identity. So that brings us to this particular slide. And I apologize, I wasn't able to read the additional comments, but feel free to reflect on those additional comments, and especially as we go into the small group. So just quickly looking into these images, which I'm sure many of you have seen, but even for me, it was hard to revisit over this past year in terms of connecting the dots of what's going on now with history. Is that what we're seeing now is not new, going all the way back to the founding of this state, which was largely obviously in stolen land, but also stolen labor when it comes to the workers that were imported here from China, from India, from other parts of Asia. And from the very beginning of this country, and especially the Western part, Asians were blamed for a variety of ills, both literal, there were past pandemics where Asians were heavily quarantined, and then there were also economic anxiety and other political crises that made Asians easy targets. And they were easy targets because it was also part of the laws that for vast majority of Asians, they have no access to rights, they have no access to the pathway to citizenship, which we're still debating to this day when it comes to the racialized immigration laws that first started with the Chinese Exclusion Act that we're still grappling with today. And then you have episodes throughout world history where, for example, in World War II, Japanese Americans who've been here for generations, who have farmed and tilled this land, who have businesses and children who grew up speaking English, they were automatically one day deemed as enemies and rounded up in internment camps. And so we understand that this is a long history that we're still reflecting and fighting, even to the recent decades where the case of Vincent Chin, and even the projection of a whole host of anxieties on people that are Asian is something that I think it's already happening in plain view over this past year, as doesn't matter if you are actually Chinese or not, if you look remotely Asian, there are a lot of people who are being attacked on the streets and being blamed for the pandemic. We even see quote unquote more positive stereotypes like the minority myth that I think we all have to also reckon with, especially in a space like this in higher education. Let's move to a time of group discussion. So Nancy's gonna send us to small groups, and we'll reflect on this question of what does it look like for us to be engaged in, and how do we see Asian Americans as part of the movement for justice. And we'll spend about 15 minutes in the small group, and then we'll come back for some reflections. So Nancy's gonna add the questions, or Frida already asked the questions in the chat, and it will also appear again when you enter the breakout room. One question is, what does social justice for Asian American and Pacific Islander communities mean to you? And what does cross-racial, cross-ethnic intersection solidarity look like for you. So enjoy getting to know each other in the small group, and we'll see you back soon.
Yeah, I mean, I think if we wanna do some share outs for folks to, if there's any ahas, questions that people are still pondering, or things that maybe had not have been mentioned so far, this I think would be the opportunity to do so. So we can start with this initial question, if that makes sense. So Sam, is like, what does social justice for Asian and Pacific Islander American communities mean to you? If anyone on the group either wants to unmute or pose it in the chat, we can take a few responses and then we'll kind of move on to the next question. Dwena.
The external processor. In our group, we're talking about the term itself, Asian American, and how it's lost its historical context as a coalition term that people brought together, knowing how diverse the community was, to work together, and that it's been sort of, well, it has been taken as an overall moniker and lost some of its teeth. And that so that when we were using the term, there is political power in using that term, but also when does it not serve us well, and how to know the nuances of that. So that came up in our conversation.
That makes a lot of sense, right? I even think when I was thinking about my own journey, right? I grew up in San Diego, and the communities that I grew up in were predominantly folks of color, right? So, and I identified as Filipino, folks identified as Vietnamese, as Samoan, as Black, as Mexican, as, we had this, like for myself, I had this sense that I didn't need to identify as an Asian American at the time growing up. And then when I got to UC San Diego, there was some power in being able to identify that, but also knowing some of the nuances that you mentioned, right? Where then Asian and Pacific Islander communities at large are also homogenized to say, well, you have a critical mass, you don't need resources, right? So kind of knowing those nuances of the power of what it means to be in solidarity and community together, but also how that can also be used to weaponize the communities too. Any other thoughts folks have that they wanted to share? And I might be missing the chat.
I'll chime in here. So my response to that first question, what does social justice for Asian and Pacific Islander American communities mean to you? For me, it means, creating awareness of a lot of these stories that seem to be hidden or seem to be specialized knowledge. These are stories that we don't often get in our mainstream learning of American history, and that slide where you had the images of systems and practices of exclusion, Chinese Exclusion Act, you had Japanese internment, you had anti-miscegenation laws, xenophobia that Sam was talking about regarding this culture of blaming not just Asian folks, but also other folks of color, the competition for labor, the idea that Asian folks were not capable of being assimilated into mainstream culture. And so justice for me means, yes, amplifying the voices, amplifying those stories, and creating more common awareness of Asian Pacific Islander American history. And what Eddie said earlier too about Asian or Pacific Islanders, actually the impact of past colonialism, and then this idea of new colonialism or neo-colonialism, and then also the ways in which we talk about indigeneity and indigenous communities within the Pacific Islander groups around us is something that also needs to be made aware of.
May I also share?
Sure thing, Amy.
I grew up living many different places in many different communities. And one thing that taught me was that diversity is in the individual. And yes, ethnicity and race play a role in that, but there's so much more that goes into the diversity of each individual. And it just breaks my heart to see people treated as less simply for how they look. And that's why social justice for Asian, Pacific Islander, American, and every other category is important to me.
So I wanted to also invite an opportunity for folks to also share about what does cross-racial, cross-ethnic, intersectional solidarity look like? In the height of, what currently is going on, right? I think often at times folks can also be put against each other too. And also knowing the realities of that, right? Like I think about anti-Asian American hate specifically in the movements, but also thinking about how anti-Blackness is also reinforced too, as an example. Any thoughts, questions, things that came up for you all in the small groups?
I'll share. My name is Sandra. My gender pronouns are she, her, hers. And I shared it with my group. With the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement over the last couple of years, it really surprised me to see so many folks from the Latinx community and the Asian community and the Middle Eastern community like show up for that movement in a way that I had not previously seen. And it felt like inspiring in a way as a member of a marginalized community for the way that we can show up for one another. And I just want to see that movement continue. Like I want to see, Black folks showing up for the AAPI community in a really real, substantial way in the ways that they showed up for us in our movement. And so I think marginalized groups kind of banding together to root out white supremacy and racism in the ways that it affects each of our communities differently and the same together can really go a long way.
Thank you for sharing that, Andra. I often think about that, right, too, in the nitty-gritty conversations about who's showing up for who and what does solidarity look like, and thinking at large, like, this is white supremacy in action, right, in terms of how it's showing up, how connections that could be made in terms of advocacy, in terms of amplifying voices, experiences, the possibilities of that, right? And so going back to this, what is systemically going on as well? And so I appreciate you, kind of chiming in and sharing your own thoughts and experiences. Anyone else have any things to share in regards to this question? And I know we're going to start wrapping up soon. I also wanted to bring it back to another slide that we had, right? And I think Andra spoke too about the recent Black Lives Matter movement in the last couple of years and showing up, seeing different folks from different experiences, backgrounds come together, right? But also I wanted to also showcase how this is also not new. It may not be as consistent and visible, but thinking about how do Asian and Pacific Islander communities show up in different movements throughout history. In this slide, you can see different images of different movements over the course of time, whether it was during the Civil Rights Movement with the Third World Liberation Front, if folks are familiar with that, and a lot of the movements that initiated at San Francisco State and at UC Berkeley. But then even thinking about our own campus and the movements that are going on our campus, right? So I have images here of the Compton Cookout and Black Winter and how students have come together through the various sit-ins, teach-outs, teach-ins, to bring a lot of the resources that we have today, right? Even things like, there's an image here of Pulse, which is one of the referendums that students, a collective group of students, predominantly from students who were part of the SAC organizations, that fought to get access to funding to run the Student Promoted Access Center for Education and Service, which these are our students providing services for our K through 16 educational pipeline to increase access, but also retain and get students matriculated into graduate and professional school if they choose. And then I also have, other images here in regards to the creation of the Asian American Pacific Islander Studies. The amount of work that students have been putting for years is just incredible. And earlier we also talked about Epimeta and how, a lot of the work that Wendy Sasaki is doing, students have fought to get resources specifically for this community, but also see how do we continue to promote justice and services and support moving forward. I just wanted to highlight some of these movements that are currently going on and that have been going on, for decades. If anyone has any thoughts or questions about that, I'd love to hear it.
Hey, Frida, it's Margaret. I don't know if this answers your question, but I really feel strongly that at UCSD, the staff has led a lot of the efforts in supporting students, even if it's not our position to do it, because we do it as a community. And I say from my experience supporting students through BSA or PASA or CSLA, CLSA, I feel, it goes to show that we super support our students, but the university has to back us up and provide more resources in terms of real funding for another staff position at UCSD, like Wendy, maybe an associate director type or something like that, because I feel like that will really show that there's that we're being seen. But that's what I really feel.
Most definitely, right? And I think, we're here, I mean, I know this is a talk for equity talks for staff by staff, and a lot of, obviously our services are geared towards students, right, as being student-centered educators, but also thinking about, well, what are the resources for staff? And a lot of the work, right, is also done on our own time. Obviously we all are also here during the lunch, for those of us who take lunch around the noon time. So thank you for sharing that experience. I want to be mindful of everyone's time, and I wanted to get us, towards the latter parts. I think if we did have time, I wanted folks to be able to think about, like, what is one action that you can take to promote equity and justice for Asian Pacific Islander American communities. I want to just give that as food for thought for you all, and know that I think for myself, I'll say this for myself, that the work doesn't end here in this talk, right? That the work continues on, and it's a continuous conversation of learning, unlearning, finding resources of how I could better support, right? Even I think going back to this idea of often with especially with current movements, talking about the AAPI community, Asian American communities are often highlighted. What about folks from Pacific Islander communities? How can I also be more aware and informed of the conditions, the topics at hand that are significant and impact that community? We want to go ahead and leave you with resources. Sam, do you want to share a little bit about the resources as we wrap up?
Sure. Jessica also earlier mentioned in the chat that she started watching the Asian American documentary from PBS, which I also highly recommend. And here are some links which I think we can share later on as a file so folks can click through it. I think one big thing right now is fighting erasure and invisibility for Asian Americans. Just consuming and learning from these different media sources, I think goes a long way in understanding that again, this is not new, and we've seen this before from the very beginning of this country, and to be able to understand those stories. And for example, even me being involved with this particular event, I learned about these oral traditions from the Hawaiian Poetry Slam. It's just, there's such rich, nuanced stories from this Asian American identity. And then Frida and Nancy have way more experience than I have in terms of working with students. And I think Satomi also shared on the link is that we have a rich history of activism here on campus and being involved. And to Margaret's point, advocate for your own department, for the larger campus to invest more through our budget and through programming so that we can really help both staff and students and faculty build power. And then lastly, externally, want to raise the fact that there's a lot of work out there being done, both here locally through the SDAPI coalition, which emerged this year in response to the rising anti-Asian hate, but we're just getting started. I think stopping hate is the very, very minimum. We also want to build power. We also want to build solidarity with other causes. To Andrew's point, we want to be able to be there for the Black and Brown communities. We want to be there for the immigration debate. We want to be there for a whole host of cross-sectional issues that affect APIs as well as other communities, and just have a voice and have a presence and bring our full selves and our stories to bear and claim America. But I think that's what these advocacy organizations are doing, both nationally and here on the ground as well. I invite you to check all those out. Feel free to continue this conversation. Like Frida said, this is only the beginning, and we have the rest of this month and beyond to continue to understand who we are, wrestle with the label, and build solidarity. That's our only way forward, is to really enlarge the concept of who is us, so then we can actually build that beloved community that Dr. King has talked about. I will pass it back to Frida and Nancy to wrap us up, and love to hear more thoughts here on the chat, or I can also stay on for a few more minutes afterwards to debrief.
Yeah, thank you, Sam. And just to echo, I think the work continues. I also just wanted to put in some of our UC San Diego, UC specific resources in there for those of you who were unable to attend Wendy's talk earlier this week. The dashboards are also a great resource to get an understanding and glimpse of our own makeup of our students, our staff, our faculty, who's in leadership, who holds positions. Obviously, estimated programs and services are there. I also dropped in the UC Count Me In campaign, which a good amount of students did some work years ago to disaggregate this category of Asian and Pacific Islander Americans into specific ethnic breakdowns that I think what Wendy has spoke about. Thank you all for being here, for sharing your ideas, your time, your presence. If you want to connect, F Alviar as my email address, you can always find me in Blink as well. But thank you so much. Any last thoughts, Nancy?
Yeah, I think you said thank you. So I'll just echo that again. Thank you everyone for joining us and sharing your time. I will go ahead and save the chat. A lot of folks suggested some good links for resources and then also recommended books and other kinds of work. And again, a copy of this recording will be available on our Cross Cultural Center YouTube channel within a week's time. So those of you who registered, I'll go ahead and send that email with the list of resources. Thank you all.
Thank you all.